Um, Thomas Kochan is the George Maverick Bunker Professor of Management at the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also known as MIT. And as before, our presenter will speak for about 25 minutes, and we're going to have some time directly following that for a Q&A period. So welcome, Professor Kochan, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and hope to have a really good discussion of the issues you're working on. Did that come through okay? Are you hearing me?
Yes, absolutely. You're coming through really clear. And of course, I've got the slides in front of me. And if I miss your cue, please feel free to let me know to advance the slides.
Okay, good. Well, if you like, we'll get started. And I'm delighted to join you in this project. I think this is such an important and timely project right now. The issue of democracy is on the table, certainly in the United States and Canada, around the world. We're seeing so many challenges and such deep divisions and such gridlock on the issues that you are wrestling with, whether it's values, whether it's what we're going to talk about, the future of work and how we can shape it and how we bring employees and build democracy from the workplace up. That's the central task, I think, because we have an opportunity to demonstrate that we can use democratic values to structure the workplace, and maybe there will be some spillover then to the larger society. So I'm pleased to be part of this. I applaud you for joining this project and look forward to our conversation. I want to speak to two issues today about the future of work, and we could spend a lot of time on other issues, but two in particular. One which I want to dispel some myths, and I want to provide more of a sense of what you can do about technology, how you can shape technology so that it improves the quality of work and improves productivity and innovation and all of the things that we hope technology will do. And I'll come to that now. But then we'll spend a lot of time on what's happening today. This enormous upsurge in worker organizing, worker collective actions, and interest in strengthening worker voice that's exploding in the United States. It's growing in Canada. It's growing around the world. But let's start with technology. And I start with this because even, before the pandemic, when people talked about the future of work, it seemed like it always revolved around, well, technology, robotics, AI, all that stuff. It's going to eat our jobs. Somehow we're going to lose more jobs than we're going to create. Some other ones would then argue, no, we'll create more jobs than we're going to lose. And that debate was going on for way too long. And in the end, MIT set up a task force on work of the future to look at this set of questions. And we came to the conclusion that that was the wrong framing. It's not the quantity of jobs. There's going to be plenty of jobs. It's the quality of jobs we have to worry about. How do we improve the quality of work, the quality of job opportunities and career opportunities for people, so that we have a thriving democracy and so the benefits of technology are spread more equitably across the economy. And so that was a major conclusion. And this comes from an MIT group that had the leading roboticists, the leading artificial intelligence experts, others who are working on big data systems, and had argued about this for a long time, along with some economists and management and political science experts. So I think that's the first important thing to keep in mind. When people start talking about new technology, don't let them use scare tactics. Don't go for these wild projections that have so much variation that no one really knows what the mix of job loss and job creation will be. But it's our job to shape technology so that it does produce benefits for business, but benefits for everyone in the workforce and in society. This little framework is what I teach. I teach an online course on this. I teach this to our MBAs and to others and other groups in society. It's the four sort of key elements. for how we can capture technology effectively and use it to augment work rather than displace just displace workers. But it requires some fundamental changes in how we address technology, and it requires much, much more involvement of the workforce itself in the key decisions, particularly the key early decisions that shape the technology. And now I'll talk about the problem we have, both in Canada and the United States. In our labor relations systems, basically, workers don't have a role in deciding the early stages of technology. What our law provides is workers and their unions can negotiate over the effects of technology on wages, hours, and working conditions. But that's after the big decisions have all been made, and they're only left to then figure out how do we adapt to all of this. I'm going to suggest here, and I want really you to grapple with how you can use this alternative framework to say no. Workers and their representatives and other stakeholders in society need to be involved in the full 4 phases of integrating and introducing these digital technologies, whether it's robotics, AI, big data systems, or others. And it starts with this first point. How do we identify the problem that technology is expected to solve, or the opportunity that we want it to pursue? And now I'm going to give you a negative example. We've all heard about driverless cars, right? Wonderful idea. But who in the heck wants driverless cars? Why is that the goal of all this technology? Well, it's because Uber and some of the trucking companies want to get rid of drivers. But if we really thought about it from a society standpoint, wouldn't we define how we use technology to improve our transportation systems, make them safer, make them more efficient, make them more accessible to people of varying needs and varying capabilities? And if we defined it that way, we wouldn't have this race of all the technology companies to try to get to autonomous trucks and cars and driverless vehicles. And by the way, the more they get into it, the more they are now concluding that they can't do that. It doesn't work. They've got to integrate. They've got to figure out what drivers, humans, do best and how the technology can augment that. And so, now when we buy a new car, we've got a lot of technology that makes it safer. We've got warnings when there's a car coming up in another lane or where we're straying off the lane that we should be in. Those are wonderful ways to improve and augment the driver and use technology appropriately. So the key is we have to be involved in defining what the problem is that technology is going to solve. And that's where we as employees, as workers, have a lot to offer, because we know how we do the work and we know what the difficulties are. And if we understand the technology, then we can work with the technologists to say, well, gee, if we design the technology this way, we could be more productive, maybe our jobs would be safer, and so on. So this is a shift, because the vendors and the engineers really don't often pay attention to the end users of the technology at this early stage. So point number 1, get involved, take action, be involved in technology design, technology definition of the problem. Second point is that we need to integrate how we work with the technology. Typically, you have the technologists design the hardware, they write the algorithms, they program the robots or whatever, and then they bring it into the workplace. And at some point, somebody says, well, do we have the right skills? We have too many of the old ones, not enough of the new ones. That's a very inefficient way. And we have learned over many years from lots of research that if you, instead of doing it in that sequential way, but you bring people who know how the work is being done and integrate changes in how we work with the changes in technology, we get highest levels of productivity and we get a satisfied workforce. And we saw this in the auto industry in the 1980s when General Motors invested too much in hardware and it didn't work. And I was in those plants and they failed. We saw this recently with this guy, Elon Musk, and Tesla, this egotistical CEO, said, I'm going to create the most automated factory in the world. We're not going to have many humans there. 2 years later, he had to eat those words because he couldn't get the new vehicles out the door. And he said, gee, maybe humans were underrated, or at least he did. So we need to change that. That is, think about how we design technology with the work systems, what kinds of changes are needed. And then we'll begin to think also systematically about point number 3. What kind of skills do we need to manage these new technologies? And how do we make sure that we plan ahead and we get those skills developed before the technology hits the doorstep? And if we do that, then we get the best of this world and we get a workforce that is prepared to add value and give wisdom to these machines. And the final point is there will be some displacement, regardless of how we design all of this. And we have to prepare for that because we have to recognize that we have some equity issues. People have to be treated fairly if they are going to lose their job or if their job is going to be negatively affected. And if we don't do that, we get resistance from even the survivors. And so this integrated approach, define the problem together, make sure you get a seat at that table, plan for technology and work systems in an integrated way, train the workforce ahead of time, and then negotiate adjustments if necessary and be fair to those people who are negatively affected. If we do these things, we will get a human-centered technology strategy that does well for the economy, does well for the investors, and does well for the workforce. So I wanted to spend some time on that because there's too much mythology about technology, and I think we can be proactive in shaping it. But now let me turn directly to the issue of worker voice. And you've been talking about this, and I want to bring now a bit, I apologize for this, a US perspective, because I'm knee deep in this, or maybe up to my eyeballs in this, working on these issues today. I'm really focused on how we can rebuild worker voice in constructive ways, in modern ways, and make sure that they are prepared to contribute to the success of their enterprise, but also to improve their jobs and to really give them a voice that I think has been lacking. And these two charts are very simple charts. The first one, basically, and they both come from a survey, a national survey of US workers that we did in 2017, before the pandemic. And we found that there's a pent-up demand for a greater voice at work. The first chart on the left shows that there's a tremendous increase in workers who are not unionized today who want to join a union. That used to be about 1/3 of the non-union workforce in prior decades. Now it's about half. And in fact, since this survey, we have evidence that that's not really completed yet, and we have some follow-up surveys, but it's clearly showing that number has gone way over 50% now. And so there was a pent-up demand, even though unions, as you know, have been declining in the US and to some extent in Canada over the last 40 years, there still is a desire for having a choice to join a union. And about half of our workforce now or more expresses that interest. But this second chart is even more telling. Is here we asked, how much of a voice, how much say or influence do you think you ought to have on a whole set of modern workplace issues? How much do you really have? And there's a gap. We found that a majority of the workforce today says we don't have as much of a voice as we think we should on, yes, compensation and benefits and promotion, job security, but also some other issues that fall outside of the traditional labor management scope of negotiations, like employee respect. And that has just exploded as a result of the pandemic. Or protections against abuse, whether it's bullying or whatever kind of abuse or discrimination at the workplace. Concerns about new technology, concerns about training, and then going on how we do our work and how we resolve problems. But it's a broad scope of issues. That's the message of this chart, of people saying, we don't have the level of influence and say on issues that we are concerned about, including the values. You were talking about values, the values that our company espouses. Does it practice it? Are we really able to contribute to making sure that we hold ourselves accountable for acting consistent with those values? So what we see in the United States, and I think the same is going on in Canada, maybe at different levels of intensity, that there's a thirst and a pent-up demand for work for a greater voice. And this is a representative sample of the workforce in the United States: full-time workers, part-time workers, professional workers, hourly workers, independent contractors. It's across the board. And the variations are not that great across the demographics. Minorities, Blacks and Latinas and Latinos are more concerned about joining a union and having a greater voice than whites, but those differences pale in comparison to the broad-based interest that we see out there. So we knew, even prior to the pandemic, that there's this pent-up demand. And then along comes this awful experience we're still coping with. But the experience of the pandemic just accelerated this and brought it to the fore even more, because people said, you know, you're essential workers and we need you. But now as things aren't quite back to where they were, but they have some of the pressures have dissipated. People don't feel that they've been treated with respect or treated as essential workers. And so that's why we are now seeing this explosion of worker activism that I haven't seen in all of my career. And you have to go back to the 1930s in the United States, when we had this great series of strikes that led to our labor law. And then maybe in the 1960s with the revolt of public sector workers. But we haven't seen what we're observing in the United States now: growing efforts to organize unions. And as we're going to show in the next chart, a wide variety of different forms of efforts to get worker voice. So let's take a look at this. And I won't present the numbers, but we are seeing an enormous growth in union organizing after a long period of decline. And the two up here in the left-hand corner are, you know, household names. You probably read about Starbucks and Amazon organizing. Amazon tried first a warehouse down in Alabama that didn't quite make it. It's still in litigation. But then one in Staten Island, part of New York City, where the workers really took charge of organizing. They were successful in winning an election, and now they have to reach a negotiated first contract. And we're seeing lots of activism across Amazon. Now, Amazon fights tooth and nail to avoid unions, sometimes legally and many times illegally. And our law is so weak. Your laws in Ontario, thank God, are stronger. And they couldn't get away with some of the things that they are doing in the United States. But it's putting up enormous resistance, using all the resources that a big monopoly like Amazon can do. Starbucks, you know, the iconic coffee house that has grown very successfully and is known as a pretty good employer. It provides reasonable wages. It provides education benefits and so on. But there's just this explosion of organizing at Starbucks, one store or one cafe at a time. And so right now there's about 200 that have organized and won an election, and there's about 300 that have filed and so on. So it's growing. It's just taken off. But and they're looking for a union representation and collective bargaining as we know it. But again, in the face of enormous resistance by their CEO, Howard Schultz, who on the one hand says, I am not anti-union, but on the other hand, I'm not going to work with this union. So you figure out where he's at. But It's an uphill battle, but you see organizing in the media, New York Times, high technology, social media, nonprofits, the service sector, and retail, an enormous amount of interest in unions taking place in the United States. And we have to ask, can we shape those union organizing in modern ways? But beyond that, this other mix of names and this Venn diagram, as we call it, this intersecting circles, shows that today workers are organizing in a variety of different ways, not necessarily seeking collective bargaining, but wanting a voice in corporate governance. So let's look at organizations like the Coalition for Immokalee Workers down in Florida. They're not covered by our labor laws, so they had to find a way to put pressure on the big retailers like Target and Walmart and Taco Bell, who buy the lettuce and buy the tomatoes that these immigrant workers from Mexico largely produce or harvest. And they found a way to negotiate with them to get some certain amount of money put aside per pound that would create better working conditions on the farms. Very creative use of a sort of sector strategy, but built around solidarity of these immigrant workers using all the tools of modern negotiations. But there are other groups. There are independent driver guilds. We can't organize independent contractors like Uber and Lyft because they claim they're independent contractors, but there's some new forms, a guild, where they say, we'll work with you, Uber, but we want a voice on a set of issues. We can't go for collective bargaining, but we want to have committees and joint mechanisms for working out issues. So that's happening. We see at places like Google, or now it's called Alphabet, and Apple, where again, there's not a lot of traditional organizing, although one Apple store has now formed a union, but their forms are, let's organize coalitions of people on the workplace level, and let's make sure that we can get people together to put pressure on the company and to engage them. And how do we make this better? How do we avoid Google losing its values by paying off executives who had been accused of sexual harassment? That led to a walkout around the world, including in Canada. So the point here is there's a variety, and some of it is traditional unions. Some of it is organizing around race, gender, social networks, and so on, and identity. Some of it is focused around providing services for workers, like the worker centers that help workers, low-wage workers, deal with wage theft and so on. And some of it is very, very on the edge of innovation, showing us there are new ways that workers want a voice, and our collective bargaining process might be too rigid, so they're going their own way. Now, we don't know, is this just a flash in the pan, or will this lead to a new era of employment relations and a new era of workplace democracy? That's the big question I get asked all the time. And it's too early to tell, but we can get there with a new era if there's more of this that continues, if we begin, the labor movement learns how workers want to organize today, and they adapt their practices to the workforce as we find it today and all of its diversity. And we can also get there if we can somehow engage employers in discussion of new forms of voice that may make sense. And then down the road, perhaps we can change our labor law and fix it. But that's a longer road. Let me end with just a summary. And these are the kind of key takeaways that I hope you will use as you go back into your conversations. First of all, a healthy democracy starts at the workplace. We can build democratic principles into the workplace and have a productive enterprise and a productive business community. And the two challenges, let's first harness technology so it works for all by engaging those 4 leverage points that starts with defining the problem and then goes on to integrate technology effectively and train workers with the skills that are needed, and then be fair to those who are negatively affected. And just remember this little motto that I use in my teaching. Technology is too important to leave to the technologists. Everybody has a stake. Everybody should have a voice in shaping it constructively to meet our needs. And then the second point is, let's take advantage of this enormous era of innovation and experimentation and the enormous upsurge in worker efforts to build more democratic workplaces by building 21st century unions that are responsive to the wide array of issues that workers are concerned about today, and that address the wide diversity of the workforce that we find today. And then finally, I do think we have to expand the options for workers to participate in new ways in corporate governance. Certainly at the workplace, in problem-solving teams to improve operations and to solve worker grievances and issues, but also at the corporate level. More and more people are talking about the need for workers to have a voice in corporate governance on boards of directors or at the strategic level of decision-making. That's a tough barrier to overcome because there's resistance from corporations, but I think it can contribute if we build workplace democracy from the workplace up to the corporate boardrooms. So I think you have a lot to think about, a lot to work on. Open up your minds to the new ways in which workers are trying to gain a voice. Let's not be bashful now. Let's use this moment, this historic moment, to fundamentally transform our employment relations system to bring democracy, more productivity, a more resilient workforce, a more inclusive, resilient organizations, more inclusive workforce into this process. So let me stop there and hear from you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kochan, for that very wonderful presentation. And I do want to go ahead and open up the floor to our members to ask a question. Please feel free to raise your hand or put a message in the Zoom chat. I already see one from Dandy. I'll get started right there. She asked for a clarification. What do you mean by 21st century union? And then I see Mohammed, you have your hand up next.
Good. Let me speak to that question because it's I should have been a little bit more specific. I'm a strong believer in the right of workers to join a union. And I'm also sometimes a critic of the bureaucratic structures that unions sometimes impose on the workplace and the adversarial relationships that labor management relations sometimes take. That doesn't work in the modern economy. We have to find ways to engage workers, to give them a voice, to build their capacity to participate in decisions at the workplace, to support them with unions that have resources, expertise, and experience, but not necessarily just carry over our grandfather or grandmother's unions. So I think that's the message. And I know you'll hear more about this from others in this program. You've got experts at Toronto at the university and Raphael and other colleagues. You'll hear from Cindy Estlund, a good friend and great labor lawyer this afternoon, and she has talked about these issues. So keep asking that question, but ask yourself, what kind of a union do you all want? What role do you want to play in leading the unions of the future? And you will define what a 21st century union looks like.
All right, thank you so much. I saw that Mohammed's hand was raised and then lowered, but there's a question from him in the chat. And then I also see that Claire and Tracy have their hands up. So the question from Mohammed, do you have an example of worker participation in corporate governance and how it can represent workers' voice? Yes,
there are some limited examples. I served on 2 different corporate boards during the 1980s and 90s for trucking firms, when there was a move to create employee stock ownership programs as a wage concession. And they were marginally successful, but not I would not put them as great models. But what we do see is many of the employee stock ownership programs today really build a role for workers at the highest level, sometimes board members, but a lot of communication between the CEO and the board and the workforce. And it's supported by workplace teams solving problems, so that I'm treated as an employee. I'm told I'm an owner, but now I'm treated as an owner, and I behave as an owner because I've got ideas on how to improve operations and people are listening to me. So we start with that workplace base, and then we can inform decisions at the board level with what the workforce is saying. Here's how we can do things differently, or here are some issues that we're really concerned about that you haven't usually discussed at the board level. And that's where the board representative can play a key role. So I wouldn't put people just on the board and leave them alone. I would argue that you've got to have a lot of communication, a lot of participation at the workplace, so that the workers believe and with credibility that yes, we're owners and we're contributing here and we're being listened to. Then you can get board membership to work.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I see that we have more hands coming up. I'm going to go right to Claire and then Tracy, and we'll get to a few more if we have time. Please go ahead, Claire.
Okay, first I want to say I love your line of technology is too important to leave to technologists. I'm going to steal that. Well, I'll try to quote you. But this question was a little too large, but if you could do the best you could in just a few sentences. What would you say to people who feel that their work is being replaced by technology, but in a substandard way? For example, I'm watching right now where a workplace is implementing artificial intelligence for file classification, but of course, artificial intelligence doesn't have the same conceptual understanding of the content matter as humans. And there's the fight to at least keep humans in for a quality control, but to say, oh no, the technology is smart enough to do it all by itself, get rid of the humans. Any thoughts for this concern that scares everyone?
Claire, that's a really, really great observation. And you have to push back on these AI designers and who's writing those algorithms. What do they know about how you work? What do they know about the conceptual work that you bring into the particular jobs that you're talking about? And if you get them to finally recognize that listening to you will make those algorithms much more responsive and much more effective, then we've got the best of both worlds. But that's a fight. It's often a fight because they think they're the experts. Now, the best of those experts are beginning to learn that they can't just use artificial intelligence to completely override human creativity, human judgment, and conceptual ability to adapt. But we got a long, long way to go. We do a lot of work at this on this at MIT, and I can tell you we have some strong allies in our engineering and science and AI laboratories, and then we got some traditionalists. You don't know what you're talking about. I know how to do this. This is going to be an ongoing battle. That's why you got to be involved in shaping those algorithms and providing input to what you don't want them to do to try to control every operation, because they will fail. So I think you've got to use that different approach to designing technology.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we have time now to get to Tracy, and then I see Fatima's hand is up. So Tracy, go ahead, and thank you both in advance for just keeping your questions as concise as possible. Try to get to both of them.
Mine's just kind of adding on to what Claire said. I know from one of my jobs I've had working in retail is being slammed right now with these self-checkouts, which is actually the store I work at specifically. Almost half the cashiers lost their jobs because of self-checkouts, and the theft in the stores is just skyrocketing because of them. So I find it really difficult to get on board with this great technology when it's costing people I know that are minimum wage essential workers their jobs. And we were not consulted.
Absolutely. And I didn't speak about the retail, but we're seeing that in lots of places where these technologies are being sold by the vendors. Say, we can make these self-checkouts, and yeah, they can design them, but they don't understand human behavior. And they don't understand what you do as a clerk and as a checkout specialist. You make sure that everyone's held accountable, that, people are paying for it, and you help them solve problems because maybe they got the wrong brand of juice that they were looking for. And so, okay, we'll be able to make that adjustment and we'll find the right thing for you. You are problem solvers, and you are safeguarding the store from the theft that we're seeing all across the country. And so now, the vendors are trying to double down with more monitoring systems and cameras and all that stuff, throwing bad technology after mediocre technology. Instead, let's use people for what they are good at. You help them with the technology to check out, but then you've got some eyes on what's going on here, and people will be held accountable. So I think you have to keep pushing back. This is a struggle, like all of these, because the retailers just see, gee, we can get rid of some of these labor costs. And what they do is, labor costs are a small proportion of their total costs, but this pilferage that they're experiencing, comes, every one of those goes right to reducing their bottom line. So let's hope they learn. Keep at it.
Thanks so much. I'm going to invite Fatima to give us our last question. I see there's lots of great comments and connections being made in the chat, so I'll invite everyone to continue on with that and read those. Fatima, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, Professor Kochan. I just wanted to say I'm thoroughly appreciative of your advocacy for a more collaborative union. I believe that's especially important in today's economy, like you've mentioned before. But I was also wondering, do you believe there are any certain policies that we should take from historical unions in the past in order to further help us in our definition of a 21st century union?
Yes, Fatima, that's a really good question. I would start with where unions have been successful. They have been grassroots unions that build up the solidarity of the membership, and then build leadership from those local leaders, so that there's much more democracy within the union than might otherwise be the case. And we have a lot of examples of that. The clothing and textile workers historically have been that way. So has some of our service employees unions. And then you have some bureaucratic structures that are more top-down led. I think that one of the critical things that we can learn from, and have to, is that today's workforce wants a voice in their union, and this is an enormous opportunity to build the next generation of union leaders who will go on. Some of them will move on from Starbucks. They're not going to be baristas all their life. Perhaps they'll go on to other jobs. And if they have a good experience, and if they were treated with respect and given a role, then as they go into these other areas, they will be responsive. They'll be favorable toward organizing in other places, or as other organizing activities come along. So we've got to use this moment to build the solidarity, the leadership, and of young workers, of well-educated workers, of workers on the front lines. And I'll end with this story that I'm so moved by. Over the last year, I've had the opportunity to work with a group that was on that slide. It was called Always Essential. And this is a group of largely minority women and immigrants and men who have been brought together by one of these worker advocacy groups. It's called United for Respect. And they're building capacity among these people to become leaders in their organizations and to serve on community level wage standards boards. And I was fortunate enough to be asked to teach them some basic principles about negotiations. I have to say it was the most moving, the most satisfying activity, even though it took up about every other Tuesday and about every other Saturday morning over the course of 7 or 8 months. But, you know, here's the future. Not only the future of the workforce and the future of work, but the future leadership. And they were so thirsty to learn modern principles of negotiations and problem solving and leadership that I think I got more out of it than they did, at least in terms of the energy I got from it. So that's what we need to do. Build these unions at the grassroots, build that next generation of leadership, and it'll pay dividends for the rest of their careers.
Some more leadership, understandable. Thank you for your response.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kochan, for your time and your expertise, lending it to this assembly. We've heard a lot of great points and clarifications around the layers and levels of organizing and exercising worker voice and the barriers to, as you said at the beginning, getting a seat at the table, especially at the top. So thank you very much. And please continue to look at some of the comments in the chat if you have time.
I will do that. Good. Thank you all. And I wish you all the best. You're doing very, very important work. And I'm so pleased to be part of it. So thank you.
Wonderful.